Lord willing and the creek don't rise, we'll get through this." Those were the last words Jake Morrison muttered before his radio crackled to life with a call that would change everything. "Emergency dispatch to Ranger Station 7, large animal in distress, Silver Oak Ranch, mile marker 23. Jake's weathered hands gripped the steering wheel as he drove toward what should have been a routine call. But nothing could have prepared him for what he saw when he arrived. A massive Brahman bull, easily 2,000 pounds of pure muscle, down on his front knees in the dirt. The animal's enormous head was pressed to the earth, dark eyes locked on Jake, with an intelligence that sent chills down his spine. Behind the bull, beneath a massive fallen oak, something small and brown lay motionless. The bull's deep, mournful bellow echoed across the Montana plains, a sound Jake had never heard from any animal before. It wasn't anger. It was a plea. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Jake cut the engine and stepped out slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel. The bull, Thunder according to the faded ear tag, remained in that unnatural position, massive shoulders trembling with effort. No wild bull should ever kneel like that. It went against every instinct, every fiber of their being. "Easy, big fella," Jake whispered, approaching with practiced caution. His heart hammered against his ribs as Thunder's head lifted slightly, those intelligent brown eyes tracking his every movement. There was something familiar in that gaze, something that made Jake's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. Beneath the ancient oak's twisted trunk, Jake could make out the small form of a calf. Little Belle, barely 6 months old by the looks of her. Her ribs rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths. One delicate leg was pinned at an impossible angle, and foam flecked her muzzle. Time was running out. Thunder let out another bellow, softer this time, and did something that made Jake's blood run cold. The bull looked directly at him, then at the trapped calf, then back again. It was a gesture as clear as any human pointing. "Help her, please." Jake's radio crackled. "Morrison, what's your status?" "Storm front moving in fast. You've got maybe 2 hours before it hits." 2 hours. Jake studied the massive oak limb, easily 3 feet in diameter, its weight probably close to 2 tons. The tree had snapped during last night's freak lightning strike, on a clear evening, no less. Strange how nature could turn on you when you least expected it. "Dispatch, I need Deputy Chen out here with the winch truck. And get Doc Hartwell on standby." Jake's voice was steadier than he felt. "We've got a rescue situation." Thunder's ears pricked forward at the word rescue, as if he understood, as if he'd been waiting 20 years to hear it. Behind Jake, another vehicle approached, Deputy Sarah Chen in her patrol unit. She stepped out, took one look at the scene, and whistled low. "You've got to be kidding me, Morrison. We're risking department resources for cattle now?" Jake ignored the question, his attention fixed on Thunder's eyes. There was recognition there, he was certain of it, but that was impossible. He'd left his ranching days behind 2 decades ago, buried them along with everything else from his old life. Thunder shifted slightly, allowing Jake closer to the trapped calf. It was an act of trust that defied explanation. The bull's massive head swung toward the gathering storm clouds, then back to Jake's face. The message was clear. "Time's running out. She's counting on you. Don't let her down. Don't let her down." Words that echoed from a past Jake had spent 20 years trying to forget. 20 years ago, Jake Morrison had been a different man entirely. 23 years old, fresh-faced, and drowning in debt that seemed to multiply faster than the cattle on his grandfather's ranch. The divorce papers sat on his kitchen table next to the foreclosure notice, both documents bearing the same cruel date. 30 days to figure out a life that had completely fallen apart. Thunder. he'd called softly to the Brahmin calf who'd taken up residence by the stone fireplace. At 6 months old, the little bull was already showing signs of the massive frame he'd grow into, but back then he was small enough to curl up on the old quilt Jake's grandmother had sewn. Thunder would follow Jake around the ranch like an oversized puppy, bottle feeding every 4 hours, sleeping in the house when the Montana nights turned bitter cold. Jake's grandfather, old Pete Morrison, had built this ranch from nothing. 500 acres of prime grazing land carved out of wilderness with nothing but determination and a belief that honest work could sustain a family for generations. "A man's only as good as his word and his land," Pete used to say, his weathered hands gesturing toward the rolling hills that stretched to the horizon. "You take care of both, and they'll take care of you." But Jake had failed at taking care of either. The marriage to Rebecca had been a mistake from the start. Two young people who thought love could overcome the grinding reality of ranch life. She'd grown tired of the isolation, the financial uncertainty, the smell of hay and cattle that clung to everything. When the oil company offered to lease drilling rights, she'd pushed Jake to take the money and move to town, start fresh somewhere civilized. Jake had refused. This land was Morrison land, had been for 3 generations. You didn't sell your heritage for convenience, so Rebecca had left, taking half of everything in the divorce, including the ranch's operating capital. The bank had been patient at first. The Morrison name meant something in these parts, but patience had limits, and Jake's credit had reached its breaking point. Thunder had been his constant companion through those dark months. While Jake sat at the kitchen table staring at bills he couldn't pay and solutions that didn't exist, the young bull would rest his enormous head on Jake's lap, brown eyes full of trust and affection. In the evenings, Jake would brush Thunder's coat and tell him about the ranch's history, about old Pete's stories of building something that would last. "Your great-grandfather started with nothing but a dream and a stubborn streak," Jake would murmur, his fingers working through Thunder's thick fur. He used to say that some bonds run deeper than blood, the bond between a man and his land, between family and the animals they tend, said those bonds were sacred, not to be broken lightly. But sacred bonds, Jake learned, didn't pay the mortgage. The buyer had come on a Tuesday morning in late spring. Harold Whitman, a corporate rancher from Texas who collected properties like poker chips. He'd offered enough to clear Jake's debts and leave him with a small nest egg, enough to start over somewhere else, maybe go back to school, learn a trade that didn't depend on the whims of weather and cattle prices. Thunder had sensed something was wrong from the moment Whitman's truck pulled into the yard. The young bull had pressed close to Jake's side, ears alert, every muscle tensed as if preparing for a fight. When Jake led him toward the livestock trailer, Thunder had balked, digging his hooves into the dirt, his eyes wide with confusion and growing panic. "It's okay, boy," Jake had whispered, his voice breaking despite his efforts to stay strong. "You're going to have a good life, better than I could give you here." But Thunder had known better. Animals always did. Loading him into the trailer had been the hardest thing Jake had ever done. Thunder had fought every step, not with anger, but with desperation, the kind of panic that comes from understanding that everything familiar, everything safe, was about to disappear. His bellows had echoed across the valley, a sound of pure heartbreak that had brought tears to Jake's eyes. "I'll come back for you, boy," Jake had promised, his hand on Thunder's massive neck as the trailer doors closed between them. "Soon as I get back on my feet, I'll find you. That's a promise." Thunder's eyes had never left Jake's face, even as the trailer pulled away, carrying him toward an uncertain future with strangers who would never understand what he meant to the only family he'd ever known. Jake had stood in that empty yard long after the dust had settled, the silence overwhelming. The ranch felt like a graveyard, buildings without purpose, land without animals, a legacy reduced to memories and regret. Within a month, he'd left for the Ranger Academy. If he couldn't save his own land, maybe he could at least protect what belonged to everyone. The work was honest, important, and best of all, it kept him moving. Rangers didn't stay in one place long enough to form attachments, to build the kind of bonds that could be broken by circumstance and poor choices. For 20 years, Jake had convinced himself he'd made the right decision. He'd built a solid career, earned respect, made a difference in dozens of communities across the state. He'd told himself that Thunder was better off, that the young bull had probably forgotten all about the failing rancher who'd bottle-fed him and let him sleep by the fireplace. But standing here now, looking into those same intelligent brown eyes, Jake realized he'd been lying to himself all along. Some bonds, as old Pete used to say, run deeper than circumstance. They run deeper than time. Thunder hadn't forgotten, and neither, Jake realized with a clarity that cut through 20 years of carefully constructed denial, had he. The winch truck's diesel engine rumbled to life as Deputy Sarah Chen maneuvered it into position near the fallen oak. Jake stood beside Thunder, his weathered hand resting on the bull's massive shoulder, feeling the tremor of anxiety that ran through those powerful muscles. The storm clouds had darkened considerably in the past 20 minutes, and the first drops of rain were beginning to spatter against the dry earth. "Morrison, you sure about this?" Sarah called out as she climbed down from the cab. "That tree's got to weigh close to 2 tons. We're talking about a major operation here, and for what? A calf that might not even survive the night?" Jake's jaw tightened. He'd worked with Sarah for 3 years, respected her judgment and her dedication to protocol. But she was young, 28, fresh from the academy, still believing that everything in life could be solved by following the manual. She hadn't learned yet that sometimes the manual fell short of what was right. "That calf's still breathing," Jake said, kneeling beside Little Belle's trapped form. The small animal's eyes were open, alert despite her obvious pain. "As long as she's fighting, we keep fighting too." Thunder shifted beside him, lowering his enormous head to gently nuzzle the calf's face. The gesture was so tender, so protective, that it took Jake's breath away. This wasn't just any bull and calf. There was a bond here that ran deeper than breeding stock or pasture companionship. Doc Hartwell's pickup truck bounced across the rough terrain, medical kit and portable equipment visible in the truck bed. The veterinarian had been tending to animals in this part of Montana for 40 years, and his reputation for miracles was legendary. If anyone could save Little Belle, it would be him. "What do we have here?" Doc asked, his trained eyes immediately assessing the situation. He was a compact man in his 60s with steady hands and the kind of calm presence that put both animals and their owners at ease. He approached slowly, mindful of Thunder's protective stance. "Calf's been trapped for at least 4 hours, Jake reported. "Right rear leg is pinned, possible internal injuries. She's conscious but weakening." Doc knelt beside the trapped animal, his hands gentle as he performed a preliminary examination. Thunder watched every movement with intense focus, but allowed the veterinarian to work without interference. It was another sign of the bull's unusual intelligence. He understood that this man was trying to help. "Fractured femur, possibly the hip as well," Doc murmured. "But she's got fight in her. Heart rate's elevated but strong. We need to get this weight off her soon, though. Much longer, and we'll be looking at permanent damage or worse." Sarah had been setting up the winch system, running heavy cable around the oak's trunk. The truck was positioned at the optimal angle for leverage, but Jake could see the doubt in her expression. "Even with full power, I'm not sure we can lift this thing high enough. The hydraulics aren't designed for this kind of load." "We'll make it work," Jake said with more confidence than he felt. He'd seen plenty of rescue operations go sideways when equipment was pushed beyond its limits. But looking at Little Belle's labored breathing, at Thunder's desperate vigil, failure wasn't an option. The first real crack of thunder rolled across the sky, and Thunder's ears pricked up at the sound. The bull's namesake had always made him nervous, a quirk Jake remembered from when Thunder was young. During storms, the calf would press close to Jake's side, seeking comfort from the booming sounds that seemed to shake the earth itself. "Easy, boy," Jake whispered, and something in his tone made Thunder's head turn sharply toward him. For a moment the years fell away, and it was just a young rancher and his bottle-fed calf, weathering another Montana storm together. Sarah noticed the exchange. "You two know each other?" Jake hesitated. Admitting to a personal connection would raise questions about his judgment, his objectivity in leading this rescue. But standing here, feeling Thunder's trust, and seeing Little Bell's condition deteriorate with each passing minute, he realized that objectivity was a luxury he couldn't afford. "We have history," he said simply. The winch cable was in position now, and Sarah had run additional support lines to distribute the load. Jake checked the connections himself, knowing that a single point of failure could turn a rescue into a tragedy. The rain was falling harder now, making the metal slippery and the footing treacherous. "On my count!" Jake called out, positioning himself near Thunder's head. The bull had remained remarkably calm throughout the preparations, as if he understood that these humans were his best hope for saving Little Bell. 3, 2, 1. The winch motor screamed as it took up the slack in the cable. For a moment nothing happened. The oak remained motionless, its enormous weight seeming to mock their efforts. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, the trunk began to shift. Thunder's bellow of encouragement cut through the noise of the machinery. He pressed forward, not interfering with the rescue, but offering his presence as support. Jake could feel the bull's massive body trembling with effort, as if he were trying to lift the tree through sheer force of will. The oak rose 6 inches, then a foot. Little Bell's trapped leg came partially free, and she tried to shift her position, but the movement caused her to cry out in pain, a sound that sent Thunder into a frenzy of protective concern. "Hold position," Jake shouted over the storm. But even as the words left his mouth, he could hear the winch motor beginning to strain. The hydraulic system wasn't designed for sustained lifting at this weight, and the constant rain was making everything more difficult. Then the cable snapped. The oak crashed back down with a sound like a gunshot, barely missing Little Bell's head. Thunder's roar of anguish echoed across the valley, and for a terrifying moment Jake thought the bull might charge the equipment in his frustration. But Thunder didn't charge. Instead, he did something that defied everything Jake knew about cattle behavior. The massive bull approached the fallen tree and began to study it with the intensity of an engineer examining a problem. He walked around the trunk, sniffed at different points, and then returned to Little Bell's side with what looked like calculation in his dark eyes. "I'll be damned," Doc Hartwell whispered. "That bull's trying to figure out how to move that tree himself." Sarah was already on the radio calling for backup equipment, but Jake knew time was running out. The storm was intensifying, and Little Bell's breathing was becoming more labored. They needed a solution, and they needed it now. Thunder looked directly at Jake, and in that moment 20 years of separation collapsed into nothing. This wasn't just a rescue operation anymore. It was a test of whether promises made in the past still had meaning in the present. It was a test Jake refused to fail. Jake stood frozen in the driving rain, staring at Thunder's left ear where a distinctive V-shaped notch caught his attention. His heart hammered against his ribs as recognition hit him like a physical blow. That mark, he'd made it himself 20 years ago when Thunder was just a calf, a simple identification cut that every rancher used to distinguish their stock. "No way," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. But there was no mistaking it. The scar pattern, the way Thunder held his massive head, even the intelligent gleam in those dark brown eyes. This was his Thunder, his bottle-fed calf who used to sleep by the fireplace, the animal he'd promised to come back for and never did. Thunder's ears pricked forward at Jake's voice. and the bull took a tentative step closer. 20 years of separation seemed to dissolve as the animal's nostrils flared, catching Jake's scent. Recognition dawned in Thunder's expression, a mixture of hope, confusion, and something that looked remarkably like forgiveness. "You two do know each other," Sarah observed, her voice sharp with suspicion. She'd been watching the interaction between man and bull with growing concern. "Morrison, please tell me you're not compromising this operation because of some personal attachment." Jake's throat felt tight as he reached out slowly, letting his fingers brush against Thunder's massive neck. The bull leaned into the touch, a deep rumble of contentment vibrating through his chest. It was the same sound he'd made as a calf when Jake would brush his coat in the evenings. "I raised him," Jake admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "Had to sell him when I lost the ranch. Haven't seen him since." "Jesus Christ, Morrison!" Sarah exploded. "You should have disclosed this immediately. Your judgment is completely compromised." "I'm calling this into headquarters." "Sarah, wait." "No!" She was already reaching for her radio. "This is exactly the kind of personal involvement that gets people killed. You're emotionally invested in an outcome that might not be achievable. That calf could be dying, and you're risking our lives because you feel guilty about some bull you sold 20 years ago." Thunder's head swung toward Sarah, his eyes narrowing at her aggressive tone. The bull positioned himself protectively between Jake and the deputy, his massive frame radiating a quiet warning. He might trust Jake, but he didn't trust the woman who was clearly threatening his old friend. Doc Hartwell had been quietly examining Little Belle during the heated exchange, but now he looked up with grim news. "We're running out of time here. Her pulse is getting weaker, and I'm seeing signs of shock. If we don't get that weight off her in the next 30 minutes, we're going to lose her." The veterinarian's words cut through the argument like a blade. Sarah stopped reaching for her radio, and Jake felt Thunder's body tense beside him. The bull seemed to understand that Little Belle's condition was deteriorating. "There's something else," Doc continued, his voice gentle but firm. "This calf, she's not Thunder's biological offspring." Jake's head snapped up. "What do you mean?" "Different bloodlines. Thunder's pure Brahmin, but this little one has Angus markings. My guess is Thunder adopted her after her mother died. I've seen it before. Bulls will sometimes take in orphaned calves, especially if they've lost offspring of their own." The revelation hit Jake like a punch to the gut. Thunder hadn't just survived the last 20 years. He'd learned to love again, to protect and nurture another creature despite his own losses. The bull had done what Jake himself had been unable to do. He'd opened his heart to new attachments instead of closing himself off from the possibility of pain. Thunder's low bellow brought Jake's attention back to the present. The bull was looking directly at him, those intelligent eyes conveying a message as clear as spoken words. "Help her. You helped me once. Help her now." "Sarah," Jake said quietly, "you can report me when this is over, but right now, that calf needs us, and Thunder needs us. I'm not walking away from them again." Sarah stared at him for a long moment, rain streaming down her face. "You realize you're throwing away your career for a cow? Some things matter more than careers." Thunder moved closer to Little Belle, nuzzling her gently with his massive head. The calf responded weakly, her tail flicking once before falling still. The sight of her growing weakness seemed to galvanize the bull's determination. He looked back at Jake, then at the fallen tree, then back again. "He's trying to tell us something," Doc observed. "Look at how he's positioning himself." Thunder had moved to the opposite side of the oak from where the winch cable had been attached. He lowered his head and pressed his shoulder against the trunk, straining against the massive weight. His hooves dug furrows in the muddy ground, but the tree didn't budge. "He wants to help lift it," Jake realized. "Thunder, you magnificent beast. You remember working together." Jake had trained Thunder to help with ranch work when the bull was younger, moving fallen branches, pushing stuck gates, even helping to right overturned equipment. Thunder had always been unusually intelligent, able to understand complex commands and work in partnership with humans rather than simply being directed by them. "You can't be serious," Sarah said. "You want to coordinate a rescue operation with a bull?" "Not just any bull," Jake replied, already moving toward the equipment. "This bull, Thunder's stronger than our winch, and he's got 20 years of experience we don't have. If we work together, combine our mechanical advantage with his raw power." Doc Hartwell was nodding slowly. "It might work. The angle would be different, but if we can get the tree to pivot on this end while the bull lifts from the other—" Thunder seemed to understand they were forming a plan. He moved back to Little Belle's side, gently licking her face. The calf's eyes fluttered open, focusing on the massive bull who had become her protector and father. In that moment, Jake saw the depth of love that existed between them, a bond that had nothing to do with genetics and everything to do with choice. Sarah looked from Jake to Thunder to the dying calf, her expression conflicted. "This is insane. Absolutely insane." "But—" She paused, watching Thunder's gentle ministrations to Little Belle. "That bull loves her more than some people love their own children." "Sarah, I'll help," she said quietly. "But when this is over, we're having a serious conversation about protocol and disclosure." Jake felt a surge of gratitude mixed with determination. "Fair enough. Doc, what do we need to do to keep Little Belle alive during the lift?" "I'll need to stabilize her leg and monitor her vitals. If we can get even a few inches of clearance, I might be able to slide her out without causing additional trauma." Thunder had been listening to their conversation with remarkable attention. When Jake approached him, the bull's ears came forward expectantly. It was time to see if 20 years had erased the understanding they'd once shared, or if some bonds really were stronger than time. "Ready to work together again, old friend?" Jake asked softly. Thunder's answering bellow seemed to say, "I've been ready for 20 years." The first attempt nearly ended in disaster. Jake had positioned the backup winch at a 45-degree angle to the oak's trunk, while Thunder braced himself on the opposite side, his massive shoulders pressed against the bark. When Jake gave the signal, both man and machine strained against the enormous weight, but the wet conditions made everything treacherous. Thunder's hooves slipped in the mud, and he crashed sideways, barely missing Little Belle's head as he fell. "Thunder!" Jake rushed to the bull's side, his hands checking for injuries. Thunder struggled to his feet, shaking his head in frustration rather than pain. The near miss had shaken everyone, except Thunder himself, who immediately returned to his position against the tree. Sarah wiped rain from her face, her expression grim. "Morrison, this isn't working. We're going to get someone killed, human or animal." But Jake's mind was already racing back 30 years, to summer afternoons when his grandfather had taught him the old ways of working with cattle. Old Pete Morrison had grown up in an era when ranchers and their animals were true partners, when understanding went both ways and respect was earned through consistency and trust. "When I was 8 years old," Jake said, positioning himself next to Thunder, "my grandfather taught me that cattle don't think like machines. They think like family members who've learned to trust each other. Thunder and we had signals, ways of communicating that went beyond words." He placed his hand on Thunder's massive neck, feeling the tension in those powerful muscles. "Easy, boy. Remember the old way, when we moved that fallen cottonwood off the creek crossing?" Thunder's ears pricked forward at Jake's tone, and something shifted in the bull's posture. He was listening not just with his ears, but with his entire body, the way he used to when they worked together on the ranch. Jake closed his eyes, letting memory guide him back to that summer afternoon when a storm had brought down a tree across the creek. Thunder had been 3 years old then, already showing the intelligence and strength that would make him legendary among the local ranchers. They'd worked together for hours, with Jake reading Thunder's body language and the bull responding to subtle shifts in Jake's voice and movement. "On three," Jake whispered, his hand moving to Thunder's shoulder. "1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi." Thunder's muscles coiled beneath Jake's palm, the bull's massive frame gathering itself like a compressed spring. Doc Hartwell had positioned himself beside Little Bell with a portable oxygen mask, ready to assist the moment they created enough clearance. 3 Mississippi! This time, everything clicked. The winch engaged with perfect timing as Thunder drove upward with his shoulder, his hooves finding purchase on higher ground. The oak groaned and shifted, rising slowly but steadily. 6 inches became 12, then 18. "Now, Doc!" Jake shouted over the storm. Doc Hartwell moved with the swift precision of 4 decades' experience, sliding a rescue board beneath Little Bell's trapped leg. "Hold it steady. Just 10 more seconds." But 10 seconds felt like an eternity. Jake could see Thunder straining against the massive weight, the bull's legs trembling with effort. The winch motor was screaming in protest, pushed far beyond its safe operating limits. One slip, one mechanical failure, and the tree would come crashing down again. "Come on, Thunder," Jake urged. "Just like the old days, boy. We're almost there." Thunder's response was a deep, guttural sound of determination. His massive frame remained rock steady, even as the tree's weight pressed down on him. In that moment, Jake remembered why he'd loved working with this animal. Thunder never gave up, never stopped trying, never let his partner down. Doc slid Little Bell clear of the danger zone just as the winch cable began to fray. "Got her! Release the pressure!" Jake immediately gave Thunder the stand-down signal, and the bull carefully eased away from the tree. The oak crashed back to earth with a thunderous impact that sent tremors through the ground, but Little Bell was free. The calf lay motionless on the rescue board, her breathing shallow but steady. Doc immediately began emergency treatment, checking vital signs and administering pain medication. Thunder hovered nearby, his massive head lowered anxiously as he watched every movement. "Fractured femur, definitely," Doc reported as he worked, "but no signs of internal bleeding. She's got a fighting chance if we can get her to surgery soon." Sarah had been quiet during the rescue, but now she approached Jake with something like respect in her expression. "I've never seen anything like that. The coordination between you two. It's like you were reading each other's minds." Jake's hand never left Thunder's neck as he watched Doc work on Little Bell. "Some partnerships don't break," he said quietly. "Even after 20 years. But even as he spoke, Jake's mind was wrestling with memories that felt both distant and immediate. The image of 8-year-old Jake learning to work with cattle overlapped strangely with another memory. Sitting in this same kitchen 35 years later, signing papers to sell the ranch. His grandfather's voice echoed across the decades. "Animals remember kindness, boy, and they remember betrayal too." Thunder's gentle nuzzling of Little Bell brought Jake back to the present. The bull's massive frame was trembling, not from exertion now, but from emotion. Jake had seen this before in the days after Thunder's mother had died during a difficult calving. The young bull had grieved openly, his distress so profound that Jake had moved him into the house to prevent him from refusing to eat. "She's going to be okay," Jake whispered to Thunder. "Doc Hartwell's the best there is." But Thunder wasn't looking at Little Bell anymore. He was looking at Jake with an expression that seemed to hold 20 years of questions. "Where did you go? Why didn't you come back? Why does it feel like yesterday and forever at the same time?" Jake found himself remembering the afternoon when everything changed. Not the day he sold Thunder, but the morning 3 months later when he'd driven past the Whitman ranch and seen his beloved bull standing at the fence line, searching the horizon as if waiting for someone who would never come. Jake had pulled over, watched for nearly an hour as Thunder maintained his vigil and then driven away without stopping. He told himself it was better that way. Cleaner. Thunder would adapt to his new life, and Jake would build a new identity as a park ranger. But standing here now, feeling the familiar warmth of Thunder's presence, Jake realized he'd been running from more than just financial failure. He'd been running from the kind of love that demanded everything and forgave everything in return. Doc Hartwell's voice cut through Jake's reverie. "I need to get her to the clinic immediately. The leg needs surgical repair, and I want to check for complications from the extended pressure." Thunder seemed to understand that Little Belle was about to be taken away. He moved closer to the calf, lowering his massive head to gently touch her face. Little Belle's eyes fluttered open, focusing on Thunder with the complete trust that only exists between a child and the parent who has chosen to love them. The parallel wasn't lost on Jake. Thunder had done what Jake himself had failed to do. He'd chosen love over self-protection, chosen to care for someone vulnerable despite the risk of loss. Sarah was already on the radio, coordinating with Doc Hartwell's clinic. ETA, 15 minutes to the veterinary hospital. Patient is stable but critical. As Doc loaded Little Belle into his truck, Thunder followed every movement with intense focus. When the vehicle started to pull away, the bull let out a long, mournful bellow that echoed across the valley, a sound of pure heartbreak that Jake remembered all too well. It was the same sound Thunder had made 20 years ago when Jake's trailer disappeared over the hill, carrying away everything the young bull had ever known and loved. This time, Jake wasn't going to walk away. The moment Doc Hartwell's truck disappeared around the bend, Thunder's behavior changed dramatically. The massive bull began pacing in tight circles, his distressed bellows echoing across the valley with increasing urgency. Jake had seen this before, not in Thunder, but in other cattle who'd lost calves or been separated from their young. It was the sound of a parent losing their mind with worry. "Easy, boy." Jake approached slowly, but Thunder shied away from his touch for the first time since they'd been reunited. The bull's eyes were wild with panic, his massive frame trembling as he stared down the empty road where Little Belle had vanished. Then Thunder did something that made Jake's blood run cold. The bull lowered his head and charged directly at the fallen oak tree, his skull connecting with the trunk in a sickening crash that echoed like a gunshot. He backed up and charged again and again, blood beginning to flow from a gash above his left eye. "Thunder, stop!" Jake threw himself between the bull and the tree, his arms spread wide. "She's getting help. Doc's gonna fix her." But Thunder wasn't listening. His eyes held the glazed look of an animal driven beyond rational thought by grief and helplessness. He tried to push past Jake, intent on destroying himself against the immovable oak that had nearly killed the calf he loved more than his own life. Sarah drew her sidearm, her training taking over. "Morrison, get clear. I'll tranquilize him before he kills himself or us." "No!" Jake's voice cracked with authority. "Put the gun away, Sarah. He's not dangerous. He's heartbroken." The deputy kept her weapon raised but didn't fire. "That bull weighs 2,000 pounds, Morrison. Heartbroken or not, he could trample us both without even trying." Thunder made another lunge for the tree, but Jake planted himself firmly in the bull's path. For a terrifying moment, it seemed like Thunder would simply barrel through him, but at the last second the bull pulled up short. His massive head dropped, and a sound emerged from his throat that Jake had never heard from any animal, a keening wail of pure anguish that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. Jake's own composure finally shattered. 20 years of carefully suppressed guilt and regret came flooding back as he wrapped his arms around Thunder's massive neck, feeling the bull's entire body shake with grief. "I'm sorry," Jake whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so damn sorry, Thunder. I should never have left you. I should never have broken my promise." Thunder's anguish seemed to recognize something in Jake's voice. Not just apology, but shared pain. The bull's frantic pacing slowed, then stopped altogether. He stood perfectly still as Jake held him, two old friends finally acknowledging the wound that had never healed between them. But their moment of reconciliation was shattered by a sound that froze Jake's blood in his veins, the sharp crack of splintering wood behind them. The ancient oak, weakened by the lightning strike and stressed by their rescue efforts, was beginning to collapse. The massive trunk was splitting vertically, and the upper portion was tilting directly toward them. "Move!" Sarah screamed, but Thunder seemed paralyzed by exhaustion and grief. The bull stood like a statue, as tons of wood and branches began their deadly descent. Jake's training kicked in with crystal clarity. He had perhaps 3 seconds before the tree would crush them both. 3 seconds to save the animal he'd failed 20 years ago. Without conscious thought, he threw his entire body weight against Thunder's shoulder, using every ounce of strength to drive the massive bull sideways. Thunder stumbled, his hooves sliding in the mud, but Jake's momentum carried them both clear of the impact zone just as the oak crashed to earth where they'd been standing. The impact sent a shockwave through the ground, and debris rained down around them like deadly hail. When the dust settled, Jake found himself pinned beneath Thunder's massive frame. The bull had fallen on top of him, but not from the tree. Thunder had deliberately shielded Jake with his own body, absorbing the impact of smaller branches and protecting his old friend from injury. "Morrison!" Sarah's voice was sharp with panic as she rushed toward them. "Are you alive under there?" "I'm okay," Jake called back, though he could barely breathe under Thunder's weight. Thunder took the worst of it. The bull was struggling to rise, clearly dazed by the impact. Blood flowed from several cuts where branches had struck him, but his eyes remained alert and focused on Jake's face. Even injured and disoriented, Thunder's first concern was for the human he'd just saved. Sarah helped Jake crawl out from under the bull, checking him for injuries. "You could have been killed, Morrison. Both of you could have been killed." "But we weren't," Jake replied, his hands immediately returning to Thunder's neck. "Because we looked out for each other, just like we always did." Thunder managed to get his feet under him, rising slowly and shaking debris from his massive frame. The cuts were superficial, painful but not life-threatening. He nuzzled Jake's shoulder gently, a gesture of reassurance that seemed to say, "We're both alive. That's what matters." Jake's radio crackled to life with Doc Hartwell's voice. "Morrison, you there? I'm at the clinic with little Belle. She's stabilized, but I need to prep for surgery immediately. How's Thunder holding up?" Jake looked at the bull, who had clearly understood his name and was listening intently to the radio. He's been better, Doc. Any word on Belle's prognosis?" "The fracture is clean, which is good news. But there's something else you need to know." Doc's voice carried a strange note. "I've been doing some research while prepping for surgery. This calf, she's not just any Angus cross. She's carrying some very rare genetics, bloodlines that were thought to be extinct. If she survives, she could be incredibly valuable for breeding programs." Thunder's ears pricked forward at Doc's words as if he understood that little Belle was special in ways beyond her role as his adopted daughter. "There's more," Doc continued. "I called around to some colleagues trying to track her origins. Best I can determine, she was orphaned about 6 months ago when her mother died during calving. The original owner couldn't afford to bottle feed her, so he turned her loose rather than put her down. That's probably when Thunder found her." Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. "Turned her loose? Out here?" "It gets worse. The property where she was born. It's been sold to developers. They're clearing the land next month for a shopping center. If Thunder hadn't found her, if you two hadn't saved her today, she would have been the last of her line." The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. Thunder hadn't just adopted a random orphaned calf. He'd saved a piece of genetic history, preserving something irreplaceable through simple love and stubborn determination. Sarah was staring at both of them with newfound respect. "So you're telling me this bull somehow found the last calf of a rare bloodline and decided to raise her himself?" "Animals know things we don't," Jake said quietly, his hand still resting on Thunder's neck. "They can sense when something's worth saving." Thunder's low rumble seemed to confirm Jake's words. The bull's dark eyes held an intelligence that went beyond normal animal awareness, an understanding that little Belle represented more than just a child to be protected. She was a trust that had been placed in his care, a responsibility he'd accepted without question or expectation of reward. As the storm finally began to ease, Jake realized that the day's events had changed everything. Thunder had shown him what real love looked like, not the conditional affection that disappeared when circumstances became difficult, but the kind of commitment that endured through separation, hardship, and even the possibility of loss. Standing in the rain beside the bull he'd abandoned 20 years ago, Jake finally understood what his grandfather had been trying to teach him all along. Some bonds were sacred, not because they were easy, but because they demanded everything you had to give. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, they gave everything back. The sound that cut through the air wasn't thunder from the departing storm, it was the distinctive whir of helicopter rotors approaching fast. Jake looked up to see a news chopper circling overhead, its camera undoubtedly capturing footage of the destruction below. Within minutes, 2 more helicopters had arrived, along with a convoy of vehicles snaking up the muddy access road. "Damn it," Sarah muttered, checking her radio. "Word's gotten out. We've got media, county supervisors, and what looks like half the state wildlife department heading our way." Thunder shifted nervously at the noise and commotion, pressing closer to Jake's side. The bull's instincts were telling him to flee, but his loyalty to Jake kept him rooted in place. Jake could feel the massive animal's tension building as strangers approached with cameras and clipboards. The first person to reach them was County Supervisor Margaret Walsh, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who'd built her political career on fiscal responsibility and government accountability. Her expression was thunderous as she surveyed the scene: damaged equipment, injured animals, and what appeared to be a major deviation from standard emergency protocols. "Ranger Morrison," Walsh's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I'm going to need a full explanation of what happened here today. Preliminary reports suggest you've exceeded your operational authority and endangered county resources for a livestock rescue." Jake straightened, keeping one hand on Thunder's neck. "We responded to an emergency call involving a trapped animal. The rescue was successful, and no human lives were endangered." "No human lives endangered?" Walsh's voice rose an octave. "You used county equipment worth over $50,000 to lift a tree for a cow without proper authorization, without following established protocols, and apparently with significant personal involvement that should have disqualified you from leading the operation." Thunder's ears flattened at Walsh's aggressive tone, and Jake felt the bull's muscles tense beneath his palm. The animal could sense the threat in the woman's words, even if he couldn't understand their meaning. "The animal in question represents significant genetic value," Jake replied carefully. "According to veterinary assessment, the calf we rescued may be the last of an extinct bloodline. The preservation of rare genetics falls under our conservation mandate." "Don't lecture me about mandates, Morrison." Walsh pulled out a tablet, scrolling through what appeared to be Jake's personnel file. "I've been reviewing your record. 15 years of solid service, but with a pattern of emotional decision-making. The grizzly cub rescue that cost taxpayers $30,000. The elk herd relocation that you insisted on conducting during peak fire season. And now this." Sarah stepped forward, her voice respectful but firm. "Ma'am, with respect, Ranger Morrison's actions today saved a valuable animal and demonstrated exceptional cooperation between human and animal resources. The bull you see here showed intelligence and problem-solving abilities that— The bull that I see here, Walsh interrupted, is a 2,000-pound liability that should have been tranquilized and removed from the scene immediately. Instead, you allowed an emotionally compromised ranger to conduct an unauthorized operation using the animal as manual labor. Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach. What exactly are you saying? Walsh's expression was granite hard. I'm saying that your actions today have created a liability nightmare for the county. If that bull had injured someone, if the equipment had failed catastrophically, if any number of things had gone wrong, we'd be facing lawsuits that could cripple our emergency services budget for years. She gestured toward Thunder, who had been listening to the exchange with growing agitation. Furthermore, this animal has now been exposed to significant trauma and stress. It's demonstrated aggressive behavior toward equipment and infrastructure. Standard protocol requires immediate evaluation by animal control. Aggressive behavior? Jake's voice was incredulous. Thunder saved Little Bell's life. He worked with us to— He charged a tree repeatedly, causing himself injury. Walsh cut him off. He required restraint to prevent further self-harm. Those are textbook signs of psychological instability in large animals. For public safety, he needs to be contained and evaluated. As if summoned by her words, a large white truck appeared at the end of the access road. Jake recognized it immediately. The County Animal Control Unit, equipped with heavy-duty tranquilizer equipment and containment facilities. Thunder saw it too. The bull's entire body went rigid, and a low rumble of distress emerged from his throat. He'd been loaded into similar trucks before, taken away from everything familiar to face an uncertain future among strangers. "No," Jake said quietly. "I won't let you take him." "You won't let me?" Walsh's eyebrows rose. "Ranger Morrison, you seem to be confused about your authority here. This is no longer a rescue operation. It's a public safety incident. You're relieved of command, effective immediately." The animal control officers were already unloading their equipment: tranquilizer guns, portable barriers, and a hydraulic loading ramp. Their leader, a burly man named Peterson, approached with the confident stride of someone who'd captured hundreds of difficult animals. "We'll have him loaded in 20 minutes, Peterson called out to Walsh. "Big fella like this will need a double dose, but he'll go down easy enough." Thunder's distress was palpable now. The bull began backing away from the approaching officers, his eyes wild with the same panic Jake had seen earlier. But this time, there was nowhere to run. The access road was blocked by vehicles, and the fallen trees created a natural barrier on the other sides. "Please," Jake stepped between Thunder and the animal control team. "Give me 5 minutes to calm him down. He's not dangerous, he's just scared." "Scared animals are the most dangerous kind," Peterson replied, already loading his tranquilizer gun. "Step aside, Ranger. This is our job now." Jake felt Thunder press against his back, the bull's massive frame trembling with fear and confusion. After everything they'd been through together, after the rescue and the reunion and the moment of perfect understanding, it was all about to be torn away again by bureaucracy and liability concerns. But then, Sarah's radio crackled with Doc Hartwell's voice and everything changed. "All units, this is Dr. Hartwell at the veterinary clinic. I've got urgent news about the rescued calf. You need to hear this immediately." Walsh grabbed Sarah's radio. "This is County Supervisor Walsh. Go ahead, Doctor." "I've completed my examination of Little Bell, and I've made some calls to colleagues at the university. This animal isn't just rare. She's a genetic miracle. Her bloodline traces back to the original Texas Longhorn herds, with genetic markers that were thought completely lost. We're talking about preserving a piece of American agricultural history." The doc's voice carried a note of excitement that cut through the tension. "But here's the critical part. Her survival and breeding success will depend heavily on stress factors and environmental stability. Separating her from her adoptive parent at this stage could cause psychological trauma. that might prevent successful reproduction. Peterson lowered his tranquilizer gun slightly. "What exactly are you saying, Doc?" "I'm saying that Bull isn't just a random animal. He's a critical component in preserving an extinct genetic line. The bond between them is scientifically significant. Breaking it now could undo everything we've accomplished today." Walsh was quiet for a long moment, her political instincts clearly warring with her bureaucratic impulses. The media helicopters were still circling, and Jake could see reporters setting up cameras in the distance. This story was going to be told one way or another. Finally, Walsh made her decision. "Dr. Hartwell, what would you recommend?" "Keep them together. Monitor the situation closely, but don't interfere with the natural bond. In my professional opinion, separating them now would be more dangerous than leaving them together." Thunder seemed to sense the shift in mood around him. His trembling decreased, and he moved closer to Jake's side. The bull's dark eyes held a mixture of hope and wariness, as if he understood that his fate was being decided by the humans around him. Jake felt the weight of 20 years pressing down on him as he made his own decision. "I'll take responsibility for Thunder, full personal liability, on my own time and property." Walsh stared at him. "You're willing to stake your career on a bull?" Jake looked into Thunder's eyes and saw not just an animal, but a friend who had never stopped believing in the promise of reunion. "Some things are worth the risk." 6 months later, Jake Morrison stood at the fence line of his new property, watching Thunder graze peacefully in the morning sun. The 40 acres weren't much compared to his grandfather's original ranch, but they were enough. Enough for a small house, a sturdy barn, and pasture land that rolled gently toward the distant mountains. Most importantly, they were enough for Thunder and Little Belle to call home. The calf had recovered beautifully from her injuries, though she still walked with a slight limp that Doc Hartwell assured them would fade with time. She bounded through the grass with the exuberance of youth, never straying far from Thunder's protective watch. The bond between them had only strengthened during her recovery, and Jake often found himself amazed by the gentle patience Thunder showed with his adopted daughter. "Faith moves mountains," Jake murmured, repeating one of his grandfather's favorite sayings, "but love moves heaven and earth." The story of Thunder and Little Belle had indeed moved heaven and earth, at least in terms of public opinion. The media coverage had been overwhelming at first. National news crews, documentary filmmakers, and wildlife enthusiasts making pilgrimages to see the miracle bull who had saved a genetic treasure. Jake had quickly grown tired of the attention, but the financial support that followed had made all the difference. A crowdfunding campaign organized by Sarah Chen had raised over $200,000 for Little Belle's medical care and the establishment of what was now officially called the Thunder's Promise Sanctuary. The name had been Jake's idea, honoring both the bull's unwavering dedication and the promise Jake had finally kept after 20 years. "Doctor." Hartwell's truck pulled into the driveway, dust trailing behind it in the crisp autumn air. The veterinarian had become a regular visitor, monitoring Little Belle's development and coordinating with universities interested in her rare genetics. But today's visit was special. It was time to confirm what they'd all been hoping for. "Morning, Jake," Doc called out as he unloaded his equipment. "Ready to make some history?" Jake nodded, though his stomach was tight with nervous energy. Little Belle was now 18 months old, and genetic testing would determine whether she carried the complete genetic markers necessary for breeding programs. If the tests were positive, she would become the foundation for restoring an entire bloodline that had been lost for over a century. Thunder seemed to sense the importance of the day. The massive bull positioned himself protectively near Little Belle as Doc approached with his medical kit. Over the months, Thunder had learned to trust the veterinarian, but he never stopped being vigilant when it came to his adopted daughter's welfare. "Easy, big fellow," Doc murmured, his hands gentle as he drew blood samples from Little Belle. The young heifer stood calmly, accustomed to the routine medical care that had become part of her life. Jake, I have to tell you, her physical development has been exceptional. Thunder's care and protection have given her every advantage. Jake watched Thunder's eyes track every movement of Doc's hands. The bull's intelligence continued to amaze everyone who worked with him. He seemed to understand that the medical procedures were necessary, that Doc was helping rather than harming Little Belle. But his vigilance never wavered, and Jake suspected it never would. Sarah Chen's patrol car appeared on the access road, followed by an unfamiliar black sedan. Jake recognized the sedan's occupants as representatives from the American Genetic Preservation Foundation, the organization that had been following Little Belle's case with intense interest. Today's visit would determine the next phase of her life. And Thunder's. Ranger Morrison, Dr. Patricia Reynolds from the Foundation, approached with the formal bearing of someone accustomed to dealing with million-dollar decisions. Thank you for allowing us to observe today's testing. The implications for genetic conservation could be extraordinary. Jake nodded politely, but his attention remained on Thunder and Little Belle. The bull had moved closer to the calf, his massive frame serving as a barrier between her and the strangers. It was a subtle positioning, but one that spoke volumes about Thunder's protective instincts. Doc Hartwell finished collecting his samples and stepped back, giving Thunder space to comfort Little Belle with gentle nuzzles. "Results should be available in about an hour," he announced. "I'll run the test right here in my mobile lab." While they waited, Jake found himself reflecting on the strange turns his life had taken. 6 months ago, he'd been a career park ranger with no permanent address and no lasting attachments. Now he was a sanctuary owner, a public figure, and most importantly, Thunder's partner once again. The partnership had required adjustment on both sides. Thunder had grown more independent during his years away, more cautious about trusting humans other than Jake. But the fundamental bond between them had remained intact, strengthened by their shared commitment to Little Belle's welfare. Jake had also changed. The guilt and regret that had driven him from place to place for 20 years had been replaced by a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since his grandfather's death. He was no longer running from his past. He was building a future that honored it. Sarah approached with a tablet in her hands, scrolling through what appeared to be financial reports. "The sanctuary's doing better than we projected," she said with satisfaction. "Donations are still coming in, and we've got 3 universities interested in funding research partnerships." Jake appreciated Sarah's practical focus, but his eyes remained on Thunder and Little Belle. Money and research partnerships were necessary, but they weren't the heart of what they'd built here. The heart was the relationship between a bull who had learned to love beyond his own loss and a calf who had learned to trust beyond her early trauma. Doc Hartwell's voice cut through Jake's reverie. "Folks, I've got the preliminary results." Everyone gathered around the mobile laboratory as Doc pulled up data on his computer screen. The tension was palpable as he scrolled through genetic markers and comparison charts. "Little Belle is carrying not just the rare Texas Longhorn markers we identified earlier," Doc announced, his voice filled with excitement. "She's also showing genetic signatures from 3 other heritage breeds that were thought to be completely extinct. This animal represents the most genetically diverse breeding prospect we've seen in decades." Dr. Reynolds stepped forward, her professional composure cracking with enthusiasm. "This means she could be the foundation for restoring multiple bloodlines simultaneously. The breeding program possibilities are staggering." But Jake was watching Thunder's reaction to the news. The bull seemed to understand that Little Belle was the center of attention, and his protective instincts had intensified accordingly. Thunder's massive head swung toward the Foundation representatives with something that looked remarkably like suspicion. "There is one consideration," Dr. Reynolds continued, her tone becoming more formal. A breeding program of this magnitude would require Little Bell to be housed at a specialized facility with controlled environmental conditions and access to selected breeding partners. The genetic value she represents is simply too important to risk in a private sanctuary setting. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. After everything they'd been through, after the rescue and the recovery and the months of careful rehabilitation, they wanted to take Little Bell away again. Thunder's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. The bull stepped directly between Little Bell and Dr. Reynolds, his massive frame radiating a quiet but absolute refusal. He'd understood the threat in her words, even if he couldn't understand their scientific implications. "I appreciate the Foundation's interest," Jake said carefully. "But Little Bell isn't going anywhere. This is her home, and Thunder is her family. That's not negotiable." Dr. Reynolds looked frustrated. "Mr. Morrison, you have to understand the broader implications. This animal could be the key to preserving genetic heritage that represents hundreds of years of American agricultural history. Keeping her isolated on a small ranch is exactly what saved her life in the first place," Jake interrupted. "Thunder found her when no one else cared. He protected her, raised her, and loved her when she had nothing. You want to preserve genetic heritage? Then preserve the relationship that made her survival possible." Thunder rumbled his approval, the sound carrying clearly across the pasture. Little Bell moved closer to her adoptive father's side, her trust in him absolute and unwavering. Doc Hartwell closed his laptop with a definitive snap. "The Foundation can establish whatever breeding programs they want," he said firmly, "but they'll do it here, with Thunder and Little Bell together, or they won't do it at all. Some bonds are more valuable than any genetic sequence." Sarah nodded her agreement. "The sanctuary has legal custody and we're not transferring it. End of discussion." Dr. Reynolds looked as though she wanted to argue further, but something in the unified front before her, Jake, Doc Hartwell, Sarah, and most impressively Thunder himself, seemed to convince her that this was not a battle she could win. "Very well," she said finally. "We'll work with the sanctuary to establish protocols that protect both the genetic integrity and the family bond. But I want it on record that this is unprecedented." Jake smiled for the first time all day. Good things usually are. As the Foundation representatives departed and the crowd dispersed, Jake found himself alone with Thunder and Little Bell in the golden light of late afternoon. The bull moved close to Jake's side, his massive head lowering to accept the familiar comfort of Jake's touch. "We did it, old friend," Jake whispered. "We kept our promises." Thunder's answering rumble seemed to say that some promises were always worth keeping, no matter how long they took to fulfill. Little Bell bounded over to join them, her limp barely noticeable as she nuzzled against Thunder's shoulder. In that moment, watching the setting sun paint the pasture in shades of gold and amber, Jake understood what his grandfather had been trying to teach him all those years ago. Love doesn't wear a watch, but it's always on time, and sometimes, if you're patient enough and faithful enough, it gives you exactly the second chance you need to get things right. As the three of them stood together in the fading light, man, bull, and calf, Jake realized that home had never been about the land or the buildings or even the animals themselves. Home was about the promises you kept and the love that made those promises worth making in the first place. Thunder's promise, sanctuary, would endure, not because of genetic preservation or scientific research or public funding, but because it was built on the foundation of bonds that time had tested and found unbreakable. And that, Jake thought as he watched Thunder gently guide Little Bell toward the barn for evening feeding, was the most valuable heritage of all. Sometimes the most powerful stories aren't about strangers. They're about the promises we made and forgot, the bonds we thought were broken beyond repair. Jake Morrison spent 20 years running from the guilt of abandoning Thunder, convinced that some mistakes can't be undone. But when that magnificent bull dropped to his knees and begged for help, he was really asking Jake to remember what old Pete Morrison always said: "A man's only as good as his word and his land." Thunder never stopped believing in the promise Jake made that heartbreaking morning: "I'll come back for you, boy." This story reminds us that it's never too late to honor our commitments, to choose love over fear, to build something lasting from the ashes of our regrets. Jake discovered that home isn't about the property you own, it's about the promises you keep and the love that makes those promises sacred. Thunder's Promise Sanctuary stands today because one man finally had the courage to stop running and start rebuilding. In our golden years, we all have thunders in our past, relationships we abandoned, dreams we postponed, promises we thought time had erased. But love doesn't wear a watch, and second chances don't have expiration dates. What promise from your past still weighs on your heart? Have you ever experienced a reunion that changed everything you thought you knew about forgiveness? Share your story below. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.